Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Actually, get 2. This is going to be a long video. I'm dreading the amount of editing I'm going to need to do on it. Today, this is going to be common Path of Exile 1 mistakes. Things that I wish I'd known earlier. This is the pre-327 edition, and it's going to contain a bunch of tips, both for veteran players who have been playing Path of Exile pretty much forever, but probably more useful to those of you that have recently gotten into Path of Exile 1, potentially after first encountering the franchise through Path of Exile 2. You gave POE 2 a try, you then decided, oh, let's go and check out the original game as well, and perhaps now you like both of them, perhaps now you prefer Path of Exile 1. Now, there are an enormous amount of interactions in Path of Exile 1, and ultimately, even though this video is going to go fairly long, it's not going to be able to cover every commonly made mistake. It's going to be based upon submissions that were made to my Discord. Now, if you're interested in joining that Discord, I'm burning in a link to it on the screen right now. If spam was less of an issue, I'd also put a clickable version of that link down in the description below. But unfortunately, the more convenient I make it for real people to join the Discord, the more convenient it is for spam bots to find it, and I kind of don't want them there. If you're interested in joining the Discord, there's the link. If you're not interested, that's cool too. Why am I making this video? I got the inspiration for this video when I was on /r/pathofexile builds, which is a quite useful subreddit, and someone there was asking questions about why their build was underperforming. And I'm having a look through and I noticed a very understandable mistake that they'd made that was not one I had seen before. They clearly believed that Searing Exarch Implicits and Eater of Worlds Implicits were mutually counterposed. That once you had one on an item, if you then tried to add the other type, it would presumably delete the existing one, or maybe it wouldn't work. So that's not correct, but I can understand how someone would think that, because a lot of the other influences in the game kind of work differently. And there's just 1,000,001 different systems throughout Path of Exile 1's history, where veteran players don't make these mistakes because we played the game when these systems were new, so we studied them carefully when they were implemented. But for people who've come along later, they haven't spent as much time learning this system and being super excited by this system when it's the only thing they're trying to learn. Instead, they're trying to learn 1,000,001 different things at once, and they end up assuming that things that apply to one system also apply to others. That mistake was made. It was not on a ultra budget character because they did have a headhunter, so they had a few divines behind them. They definitely could have afforded the other implicits, at least low tiers of them, but they just didn't realize that they were a viable option to add to their items. Well, that got me thinking, what other common mistakes are being made by the player base? And I put out a call on my Discord for this. I posted in Discord asking people to let me know something that they got wrong early in their Path of Exile career that most veteran players just think is obvious now, but that they didn't realize. There are a whole lot of things related to socketing, related to linking, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to timestamp this into chapters so that you can jump around as needed. Also, because I have a bit of a trolling problem, as soon as I sent off this message, I then immediately followed it up in Discord with a text-to-speech thing that was intended to set off people's mobile phones, and apparently it worked for a few people. I know that because it worked for me, and so my phone ended up playing the song in question because of this request that I made as a joke text-to-speech. Oops. Anyways, we're going to start with the single most important mathematical thing in Path of Exile 1. There is a very, 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 very specific language when it comes to increased and more. This is something that veteran players have learnt, and it sticks with Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 as well. The same wording is used in both. Ultimately, while this is one of the things that people who have played the game for a little while do already know this, it's also the most detrimental thing to be wrong about. So when you have modifiers that use text like increased and reduced, all of these get added together across your entire character, and then they become one single scaling layer. For example, if I have 145% increased fire damage on the tree, and then on my weapon I have 77% increased elemental damage with attacks, then those two are going to add to 222% if I'm talking about scaling fire damage that is made with an attack, i.e. something where both of these apply. So this 222% increase becomes one single multiplier times 3.22. However, every single more multiplier, every single less multiplier is an independent multiplier. So if you've got 5 things that say 20% increased, these are going to add up to 100% increase, which means double. If you've got 5 things that say 20% more, then these are all going to multiply together. 1.2 times 1.2 times 1.2 times 1.2 times 1.2. This then happens to be 248% of the baseline amount. And if it's larger multipliers than 20%, the gulf between increased and more gets even wider. So if you had 5 multipliers that all said 200% increased, you would do 11 times the base damage. But if you had 5 multipliers that said 200% more, you would be dealing 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 times 3, which is 243 times as much damage. You can see there's a big gulf between 11 times and 243 times. So, the general rule of thumb here, more and less multipliers are higher impact than increases and reductions, with one very important exception. And this comes up when you're reducing something below 100%. That's the reason that less duration support, which you can see on the screen now, that's the reason that this is less skill effect duration rather than reduced duration. If this actually read reduced duration instead, then it would stack very, very strongly with the sources of reduced duration that are available on the passive tree. So in the rare situations where you do want to decrease the duration of a gem, for example, Stormcall, for example, Earthquake, it would actually be advantageous if less duration support were to be replaced by a reduced duration support. In that situation, you'd be able to scale to 100% reduced duration by using this hypothetical reduced duration support in conjunction with the reduced support nodes that exist on the passive tree. Ultimately, more and less multipliers are higher impact than increased and reduced, except when you're trying to reduce something below its baseline value, and then reductions are more impactful than less multipliers. The next thing we need to talk about is item levels. Now this is a hidden stat that's found on items. The way that you can see hidden stats is by holding Alt when you mouse over the item. This governs a lot, which explicit modifiers the item can roll, and a lot more. Now, as of patch 3.26, I'm not guaranteeing this is still the case in 3.27, though it has been a long time since this has changed. Item level 86 is the functional cap. You can get higher than 86, it can go up to 100, but there is no difference between 86 and 100. In some item slots, it's actually 85. For example, in the helmet slot, there is no difference between the pool of modifiers that can roll on modern day Path of Exile 1 helmets. If they're item level 85, 86, or even 100, they'll have the same pool of modifiers, but that's not the case universally. And also, that could change with patch 3.27. It has changed in the past. Now, it's important to note that there are some crafts, not very many, but some, that actually require a non-maximized item level. I'm not going to go into full details of this, but the budget way to craft a +2 to the level of Chaos Skill Gems wand is actually not possible to do on item level 83 and above wands. And the reason for that is there is an item level 83 plus modifier that pollutes the mod pool. So it gets in your way, and it means that the strategies that you would use that are really, really efficient end up not working. Now, item level governs the maximum number of sockets that an item can have. You need item level 2 in order to roll 3 sockets on an item. You need item level 25 in order to roll 4 sockets. You need item level 35 in order to roll 5 sockets. And you need item level 50 in order to roll 6 sockets. There are a couple of ways that you can circumvent these, so if you do see an item that breaks this rule, it's probably come out of a strongbox or it's been created using the crafting bench. It's not impossible to circumvent this, but it's something that you're not going to see very often. Now, we want to talk about item mistakes that people make early on. Modifiers that are found on weapons are counterintuitive because they can have the same text as something that you find on a ring, but they will actually work in different ways. Anything that says percentage increased physical damage that is found on a weapon, that is for the physical damage that is dealt by attacks with that weapon. For example, if you cast a spell like Exsanguinate, which deals physical damage, then a wand that says 77% increased physical damage or 162% increased physical damage, this is not actually going to boost your damage with Exsanguinate. However, if you're instead doing a spell like Fireball, which deals fire damage, and your wand read 82% increased fire damage, that would count to Fireball. So this is something that's really counterintuitive. So what's going on here is that there are certain modifier groups that only apply to the weapon itself. Percentage increased physical damage is one of these. Also things related to attack speed, critical strike chance, these affect the stats of that weapon. At the same time, other percentage increases that are found on weapons, they will apply to your character instead. It is just going to take a little while in order to work out all of these rules. And the Path of Exile player base tends to call things local if they only apply to that item, and global if they apply to your entire character instead. This is the reason that attack speed on weapons is much stronger than it looks like. It's actually written as an increase to attack speed, but the practical effect that it has is a more multiplier to attack speed on your character. Going back to that difference between increases and more multipliers before, it ends up that it's functionally a more multiplier even though the actual wording that's used on the item is an increase. So 26% increased attack speed on your weapon is a lot more valuable than 26% increased attack speed found on the passive tree would be. When a weapon says adds X to Y damage, this is to attacks unless the weapon specifies otherwise. However, when a ring or something in another slot says adds X to Y damage, this is going to be to attacks and dispels. Again, really convoluted, really confusing wording here. It's something I would like to see actually called out by grinding your games as this is a local modifier, this is a global modifier, rather than players having to learn from experience which is which. Now, increases to special types of damage do not apply to your minions if they deal that sort of damage. So if you have a wand that reads 60% increased fire damage, we've already ascertained that this is 60% global fire damage, so it adds to your entire character, but this 5% does not apply to your minions, even if those minions are dealing fire damage. Only minion percent damage works for scaling up damage that you outsource to your minions. However, just to add to confusion here, this is not the case when it comes to totems, traps, or mines. They use your skills instead. So there's one set of rules for minions, one set of rules for totems, traps, and mines. And there's going to be another set of rules again later when we start talking about kill attribution, which is going to be a whole additional can of worms. If you're ever unsure, test it out in Path of Building. Path of Building is a free software app that's been put out that is pretty useful for modeling all sorts of things inside Path of Exile numbers-wise. Now, adding to the confusion here, there's a number of gems that deal damage over time. Increases to the amount of spell damage your character does do not scale this damage over time, unless the gem dealing damage over time explicitly says that it does. So for instance, the gem Righteous Fire does have a modifier that says that modifiers to spell damage also scale this damage over time. But if that wasn't present, then it would not be scaled by it. This is particularly important if you find a way to deal damage over time with a gem that's not really designed for damage over time. Gems that are designed to deal damage over time, they pretty much all have this text, but if you find a gem that's not designed for it, then you'll find that it won't necessarily work the same way. Another common item mistake, there are a number of things that say you deal double damage or you deal triple damage. Double damage and triple damage do not stack with each other, they do not stack with themselves. Also, both double and triple damage do not apply to damage over time, which is another thing that catches a lot of people out. It feels really counterintuitive. Next, we're going to jump to some tips related to the campaign. Now, there's a number of commands that you can type in the chat window. One of them is /passives. When you're in the middle of a campaign, this will give you a list of all of the quests that you have completed that have awarded you skill points. However, when you have completed the campaign, this will also be extended to list all of the quests that could award skill points, but that you did not get skill points from. Once you've done the campaign, you probably want to type /passives. It's almost always the case, unless you're very experienced with the campaign, that you'll have forgotten one or two really important quests. If I had $1 for every time I had not turned in the quest to do Piety in Act 3 or to help Clarissa in Act 8, well, I'd probably still need to work for a living, but I would definitely have a fair few dollars as a result of that. So, you can always check this, and the only quest that should ever read 0 passive points is if you've made a choice in the Deal with the Bandits quest that does not award a skill point. For instance, my personal default is I'll always take 8% movement speed there, but other people do think differently, and if you prefer to take 1 skill point, you can do that. If you prefer to take 15 tri-res, you can do that. And in those cases, you will end up with a single 0 there, but everything else should read 1 passive or 2 passives, and /passives will just help you find out which mistakes you've made. I have hit level 95 without every passive point that's available in the campaign, which is reasonably silly. Now, the next campaign tip relates to attack-based builds. If you're playing a build that primarily deals damage with a weapon, you should be looking to upgrade weapons frequently during the campaign. When you get access to item level 62 gear, and this is going to be early in Act 9, you are going to get huge upgrades if you're using elemental attack weapons. So level 62, you really want to look out for this. Now, I'll come back to the topic of vendor recipes later, but if you've got essences that can source you an upgrade, use them. If you don't have those, then you're going to want to use some of those vendor recipes. For spell builds, you can ride a +1 to a class of skills weapon all through the game. So you can find these even in Act 1. You might get something that says +1 to the level of fire spell skills. If you're using a fire spell skill, then this is going to be something that is serviceable all the way through the game, all the way up until at least early endgame. However, you will get more damage if you can find a level appropriate X to Y cold dispels, or the equivalent for a different element, this is going to be better than +1 to the category of skills. This ceases to be the case once your gems reach level 19. Once your gems reach level 19, then +1 to a gem level is worth more than the best rolls that are available of X to Y flat elemental damage to spells. But the short of it is, +1 gems is always reasonable. It will grow as your character does, whereas X to Y flat spells is better when you get it, but it will become obsolete quicker. The other thing you really want during the campaign is the crafting bench. You'll unlock this in Act 2 when you save Helena. This is probably something you'll do about character level 16. And then from then onwards, you'll be able to augment items with an additional modifier on them. This is an absolute godsend. Anytime you feel you're not powerful enough to progress, go and see what you can afford to do with the crafting bench. The crafting bench alone will give you a huge amount of power all the way through the campaign, all the way through early maps, and it will still continue to be useful even when you get to middle maps. And if you're doing Act 8 solo, like most people tend to do, I would strongly recommend that you do it in a counterclockwise direction. So go to the key first. This tends to be faster than going the other way. Now we have a fun section on socketing and linking. We've already talked about this, but I do want to reiterate it. There is a maximum number of sockets your item can have, and that is based upon that hidden stat of item level that you can get by holding Alt on the item. Item level 2+ required to reach 3 sockets, 25+ for 4, 35+ for 5, 50+ for 6. One of the most common mistakes I see brand new people make is not understanding that sockets need to be linked as well as just present in the same item. Your support gems need to be connected ultimately by a chain of links to the gem that you want them to support. They don't need to be directly adjacent in the link, they just need to be connected via a series of links. Now, there is a very, very, very strong bias against rolling 5 links or 6 links on an item. Getting a 5 link by yourself by your 50th map in Endgame, this is very reasonable. Getting a 6 link by yourself, even by your 100th map, this is very reasonable, but it does require a plan. You're not going to get this by RNG unless you're very, very lucky, and it's something like 1 in 1,000 to turn a 6 socket item into a 6 link using a single Orb of Fusing. However, something a lot of people don't realize is that if you have an item that is already 6 socketed, it is about 40% more likely to go to 5 or more links than a 5 socketed item would be. The reason for this is that with a 6 socket item, there are 3 ways you can win. You can get the miracle of getting complete 6 link, which is not going to happen very often. You can get the first 5 sockets linked and then the last one disconnected, or the rarer outcome is that the first one is disconnected and then the last 5 are linked. It turns out in practice that for every time you hit a 6 link, you will on average hit 10 of the forwards 5 links and 3 of the backwards 5 links. So what this means is that if you've got a 5 socket item, you've got 10 ways to win. If you've got a 6 socket item, you've got 14 ways to win. You've got the same 10, plus you've also got the complete 6 link, and you also have the option of a backwards 5 link as a fallback. And so if you're going to try and make a 5 link, always 6 socket the item first. Additionally, there is a special currency item. This only comes from engaging with Beyond content that is called the Tainted Fusing Orb. This thing is incredibly, incredibly powerful early in progression if you can get your hands on them. They are rare. They're not something you're necessarily going to drop yourself when you want it. But if you do happen to come across one, or if you're willing to trade for one, they're extremely good, especially if you want to get 6 link sockets on a unique item, and especially if that unique item is not all that rare. If you are interested in using Tainted Fusing Orbs, what I would recommend that you do is manually 6 socket the item by directly applying Jeweler's Orbs. There is also an Omen that will make this faster. If you're playing in Trade League, buy the Omen if the Omen costs less than 300 Jeweler's Orbs do, and do not use the Omen if it costs more than 300 Jeweler's Orbs do. Once you've done that, then manually 5 link the item. If you accidentally 6 link it, fantastic. That's only going to happen very rarely, but if it does happen, amazing. And then at this point, you are going to then apply a Val Orb to the item. You're hoping at this point that the item does remain unique because there is a chance for it to turn into a rare item with random garbage stats. But assuming that doesn't happen, you'll end up with a 5 linked corrupted. At this point, Tainted Orb of Fusing is 50-50 to upgrade that to a 6 link. If that happens, fantastic. If not, it's going to depend upon the current Trade League economy as to what you do from there. But quite often, you just want to start over again on a brand new item. There is also the option on the crafting bench to spend a whopping 1,500 Orbs of Fusing in order to deterministically 6 link an item. This is something you can consider doing, but I want you to know something with it. It is ripping you off. It's like an insurance policy. It will insure you against the worst luck you could have, but it is going to be one of those insurance policies that's sold by someone that's making a lot of commission on the side, because the single largest sample size test that's been done indicated that it is 1 in 1,000 to 6-link an item. This might not be exactly right. There's other tests that have been done that are a bit smaller that indicate slightly worse odds, like 1 in 1,200. But either way, 1,500 is more than it's going to cost on average. But if you really can't afford to get unlucky, then it is an option that you can consider. For most people though, the first 6-linked item that you get will actually be from a divination card that explicitly awards a 6-link item, or alternately, it will be from a monster directly dropping them, and this is something you won't see until you're very far into the endgame, but there are a couple of mechanics that make that a little bit less unlikely than it would otherwise be. Now, while we're on the topic of socketing and items, socket colors need to be mentioned here. There is a very, 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 very strong bias when you apply a chromatic orb to an item, or alternately, when you just pick an item up off the ground, if it's generated from a loot drop. There is a very strong bias towards the colors on that matching the attribute requirements of the item. So red is strength, blue is intelligence, green is dexterity. This bias is pretty weak during the first half of the campaign, but it starts becoming stronger as those attribute requirements get higher. It's a moderate bias in the second half of the campaign, and once you start getting to level 73, 78, and 84 bases, this bias becomes absolutely overwhelming, absolutely crushing. I want to give you a bit of an example here, and this is a Twilight Regalia. Twilight Regalia has one of the highest intelligence requirements in the game at 293. It also has equal lowest dexterity and strength requirements at 0. The weighting on these is believed to be 17 higher than the attribute requirement. So 17 to 17 to 310. What this means in practice is it is less than 5% to roll a red socket in the first slot on your Twilight Regalia, less than 5% to roll a green socket, and more than 90% to roll a blue socket. This is fine if what you want on your character is 5 blue and 1 red. If that's the case, you're going to have no trouble rolling that on your Twilight Regalia. But what if you wanted something very different? What if you wanted 2 blue, 2 red, 2 green? What if you wanted 4 red, 1 blue, 1 green? Or 5 red and 1 blue? Well, there's a couple of workarounds here that we'll get to in a sec. Now, it's worth noting that this matters the most on bases that have extreme attribute requirements. There's a couple of unique items. Mjolnir comes to mind here, Blunderbore comes to mind, Garb of the Ephemeral. All of these have extraordinarily high attribute requirements. They've been massively increased beyond what's normally available on that item. As well as this, some special enchanted items that you can pull out of Heist can also triple the attribute requirements on items as well. So that's another one to look out for. So you might find this bias to be beneficial if you wanted to get 5 blue and 1 green on your Twilight Regalia, or you might find it to be manageable if you wanted to get 4 blue, 1 red, and 1 green. That's going to be manageable. You'll have to throw a fair few chromes at that, but you will get it. But if you want to completely bypass these problems, your first option is Tainted Chromatic Orbs. These can only be used on corrupted items, and they completely ignore this bias. Everything is just rolled equally and fairly. I'll get to the exact odds in that in a second. Also, using the crafting bench from Helena, you can set up to 3 colors at increasingly high costs in chromes. This is really good if you want something like 3 blue and 3 red on a Twilight Regalia. You can also add and remove 1 socket at a time. Each time you do this, the color of the new socket that's added is going to be re-rolled. This is the best way to get 5 off colors, and it's even a serviceable way if you want to get 6. Also, the endgame mechanic Harvest can bleach sockets white 1 at a time. This is something that is RNG though, because it can roll a socket that is already white. A white socket can fit a red, blue, or green gem in it. There are other mechanics that can bleach sockets white as well, but they tend to be riskier. Now, I mentioned Tainted Chromatic Orbs there. These are the odds for Tainted Chromatic Orbs. If you want to get 6 of the same color, 1 in 729. In other words, don't. If you want 5 of one and 1 of another, it is 6 in 729, which is a little bit less than 1%. If you want 4 of one and 2 of another, it is 15 in 729, aka 1 in 48.6. If you want 4 of one, 1 of one, and 1 of one, so this is an example, 4 red, 1 blue, 1 green, it is 30 in 729, which is 1 in 24.3, a bit more favorable than 4%. For 3 of one and 3 of another, it is 20 in 729, which is about 3%. For 3, 2, and 1, it is 60 in 729, which is about 8%. And if you want 2 blue, 2 red, 2 green, then it's going to be 90 in 729, also known as 1 in 8.1, also known as something like 12.25%. So those are the odds with Tainted Chromatics, and that's to get the perfect selection of those colors that you wanted. So when I say 3, 2, 1, that doesn't mean just to get 3 of one color, 2 of another, and 1 of another. It is to get exactly 3 red, 2 green, and 1 blue. That's why you'll find that almost 50% of rolls of Tainted Chromatics will end up in some configuration of 3, 2, and 1, because there's 6 ways around that can be ordered. Now, let's jump to the end game. Let's start talking about tricks when it comes to completing your atlas. These are aimed at a beginner, and then there's going to be some more intermediate ones. Firstly, the most important thing of all, Kirac sells maps. All those orbs of chance you've been collecting through the campaign, all those alchemy orbs you've been collecting throughout the campaign, this is what they are for. You want to be buying all useful maps, which is basically every map you haven't run yet, plus any map you want to run again. Just buy all of those each time his shop resets. The way that you make Kirac reset his shop is by one of his missions. Now, this is the reason that most people, when they first get to maps, they make pretty much a beeline to the commissioned officer notable on the Atlas passive tree. This way, you can end up with 14% chance from very early on to get Kirac missions after you complete any map. It's worth noting you don't even need to go into the mission that Kirac opens. All you need to do is just wait until the first portal opens for that mission, and then at that point, his shop is going to reset. Now, you can vendor 3 of the same map, and when you do this, it will return one of a higher tier. And when I say 3 of the same map, what I mean is, for example, 3 beach maps that are all tier 14. If you were to vendor 3 of those, you would get back a tier 15 map, but there'd be a degree of randomness as to which tier 15 map you get back. There is a little trick here, though, that's not very obvious, and that is that it actually depends upon hidden variables on each beach map that you vended as to which tier 15 base you're going to get back. And so, for instance, if you've only got 4 Scriptorian maps, you can vendor numbers 1, 2, and 3, and before you commit the trade, you can look and see, oh, that's a map I'm not interested in. Okay, I'm going to remove number 3 and I'm going to put in number 4 and get a different option. If you're still not happy, you can remove number 2 and put in number 3. And if you're still unhappy, you can remove number 1 and put in number 2. You've then checked all 4 different combinations, and then it's up to you whether you commit one of those trades or whether you wait until a 5th Scriptorian map drops, and then you try again with those. Now, once you take those early Kirac notables, you will find that your Kirac missions will tend to snowball. If you're ever desperate for a mission, especially if you get really unlucky on RNG for these, you can repeat maps. You probably won't need to repeat maps, especially as a veteran player, but if you are someone that's just finding your feet, there's nothing wrong with repeating maps. It'll just mean that you can tackle higher tier maps with more loot and also with more XP on your character. I want to just point out a little warning though, and that is that most of the danger doesn't actually come from rising up the tiers, it comes from the map modifiers themselves. Normally when you die in Path of Exile 1, it's because you underestimated a map modifier. Let's jump to some intermediate Atlas tricks here. These are again things a lot of veteran players will know, but they're worth keeping in mind, and some of these are recent changes. The first one actually is a very recent change. Horizon orbs that are applied to Elder Slayer or Guardian maps, they will change which Atlas mini-boss they contain. Now, people generally know this to be the case with the Shaper Guardian maps, but this is now also true for Elder Guardian maps. This is also true for the Elder Slayers. This is going to help you a lot when you're unlocking your Void Stones, and you might want to hoard a moderate number of Horizon orbs in order to get over that little step. The other thing that's worth noting, and this is not true in solo self-found for obvious reasons, the currency exchange will often let you swap one left side or right side Uber Elder fragment for the other. Let's say you've got a fragment of Shaping and you want a fragment of Knowledge. You can go and see if that's available. Quite often, it'll be available for an instant one-for-one transaction, and that's only going to cost you a few hundred gold to do that. It's worth noting though, this is dependent upon the luck that's been experienced by other players. Right, so let's get to those craftable item implicit modifiers that we started talking about right at the beginning. This is Searing Exarch and Eater of Worlds implicits. Exarch and Eater content, this is going to unlock craftable implicits. These will overwrite any implicits that are natively on an item. For example, Fugitive Boots. Fugitive Boots have a pretty good implicit on it. They grant you a bunch of chaos resistance. Almost no one uses them, and the reason for that is that the implicits that you can get from the Eater and Exarch system are just better. So you're going to want to use those instead, and the Fugitive Boots end up just not really any better than any other boots would be. Now you can have one of each type of these implicits on an item, and items that are modified with these implicits can then be further modified with the pretty rare but very strong Eldritch Chaos Orb. And there's also an Eldritch Orb of Annulment and an Eldritch Exalted Orb as well. Eldritch Exalted Orbs are kind of neither here nor there, but the Eldritch Orb of Annulment and the Eldritch Chaos Orb are very, very strong. Worth noting that these Eldritch currencies mostly drop from the Searing Exarch, the Eater of Worlds, and their lieutenants when they're fought at monster level 84, but they can drop as just generic drop anywhere loot. When they do, I believe them to be 10 times as rare as Divine Orbs, so you're not going to see them very often, but they're a nice little bonus when you get one. Ultimately, these are a tool that are much more accessible if you're playing in Trade League, because across the Trade League, there are quite a lot of them dropping, even with them being rarer than Divines. Now, an advanced tip that comes up when we're talking about these Eldritch currencies and these Eldritch implicits on items. There is a bestiary craft that is called the Phenomenal Plagued Arachnid, also known by players as the Split Beast. When you apply this to an item that has Eldritch double influence, so it's got both a Searing Exarch and an Eater of Worlds modifier on it, you're going to end up with two separate items, two separate split items. One will have only the Searing Exarch mod, one will have only the Eater of Worlds modifier on it. However, if instead of using a Phenomenal Plagued Arachnid, you used a Fractured Fossil in order to split the item, you'll end up with two items that both have both implicits on them. You can only split an item once, so keep that in mind as a limitation, but this is a way that you can either separate out two desirable implicits that just have real anti-synergy with each other. So if you had something like Shock Spread and Fire Damage over Time Multiplier, they're not useful together, so you might want to separate them. But if you have two strong implicits that have synergy with each other, or at least don't run at cross purposes to each other, then you can duplicate that item before crafting further on it. Both of these scenarios have their uses, but the Fractured Fossil one does tend to be the stronger of the two. Also, when we're talking about these Eldritch mods, there is the Orb of Conflict. This unpredictably raises the strength of one Searing Exarch or Eater of Worlds modifier on an item and lowers the strength of another. So this can only be applied to an item that is double influenced, Eater and Exarch. Lesser modifiers that have their strength lowered will be removed. So when they say that, they mean that if you lower something from lesser tier, which is the bottom tier, then that modifier will be completely removed from the item. Now, hidden in the flavor text of this, the chance of raising or lowering a modifier depends upon its relative strength. This bias is strong. It is hidden in the terms and conditions of the Orb of Conflict there. It's something that's easy to miss that it's present. People often think this is a coin flip. It is not a coin flip. It is a very rigged coin flip. The odds of elevating the mod that is currently higher tier are estimated to be 50% minus 11% per tier of discrepancy between the two tiers. So if you have one that is exquisite tier and one that is greater tier, then that is a 3-tier gulf. And so it's only 17% we estimate to get the elevated result that you actually want there. I did a video with a link below down in the description to a Markov chain analysis that might help you when you're planning your Orb of Conflict crafts. But basically, if you want to get something elevated all the way to perfect tier, which is 2 tiers above the exceptional tier, then you probably want to make sure that when you've got one modifier that's exquisite, the other one is at least exceptional. Right, so that's a whole bunch of discussion around Eldritch modifiers. Now we're going to talk about the Path of Exile economy. What is good now won't always be. I think this is the single most important tip when it comes to Trade League economies in general. Very early on in a league though, serviceable items are expensive and premium items are not yet as expensive as they're going to get. Later on, serviceable items are ones that are just good enough to use, but that aren't necessarily the best thing you can get. They no longer sell at all, or if they do sell, they're very, very cheap. And premium items like Mirrors of Calandra, they start to become much more expensive. The more irreplaceable an item is, and also the more consumable an item is, the more that its value tends to increase over time. Now, early league, it's often good before you log off for the night to park any wealth that you've got in somewhere that's safe. And ultimately, knowing what's safe and what isn't is something that can be a bit tricky, but mirror shards or similar items like the Immortal Divination card, these were the place once, but that secret's well known now. It still works, but there are probably better options you can find. Hinokora's Locks, Veiled Exalts, Itemized Reflective Mist, Tainted Divine Teardrops, Tempering Orbs, Tailoring Orbs, all of these can be good options if you just want to transfer your wealth, especially out of Chaos Orbs early on in a league, get it into something else, and then when you log back on maybe 2 days later, you'll probably have more buying power, or at least you won't have fallen backwards in buying power. And when it comes to economy tips, often the second best thing you can do is whatever the top Magic Find streamers at the time are doing, and the best thing you can do is find ways to sell to the people that are doing what that Magic Find streamer is doing at the time. And one final economic tip, when you are crafting, you want to create items that can succeed in multiple different ways. Don't roll over something good that's not what you were trying to roll. Instead, sell it and start over. And the more expensive the starting base for your craft is, the less applicable this is going to be. So for instance, if you're starting with a 29 quality necrotic armor, then selling and starting over is more difficult than if you're starting with a 20% quality necrotic armor, in which case you'd want to sell and start over more often than you otherwise would. Let's jump next to critical hit mechanics. This is something that I see a lot of people get wrong. The way critical hits are worked out in Path of Exile 1, firstly, you add up all of the base critical strike chance sources. This is what is printed on the gem for spells, it's what's printed on the weapon for attacks. Base critical strike increases read plus X% to critical strike chance. Note they do not use the word increased anywhere in them. If they've got the word increased, the numbers will be higher and they won't be base critical strike chance. Now some gems like Heralds, they have a base critical strike chance of 0 and they can often be very hard to get any meaningful crit on. Unarmed attacks, they have a base critical strike chance of 0 as well, but it's much easier to get base critical strike for them. Once you've worked out your base critical strike chance, you then multiply this by all increased critical strike chance sources that you've got. These will read something like 67% increased critical strike chance with spells. Numbers on these are high, and you get 50% of this stat for each power charge that is presently active on your character. Again, this is a lot, especially if you scale your number of power charges up really high. Once you've got your chance to critically strike really high, critical strike multiplier becomes an incredibly powerful stat for scaling up the amount of damage your character does overall. Now we're going to jump to another topic entirely, vendor SPs. These are a surprisingly big source of early game character power, but most of them are not. So this is one of those mechanics where there's an enormous amount of things that have just built up over time in the game. Many of these are just no longer relevant to the way Path of Exile is played these days, and some of them just have some fringe uses. To give a couple of examples, there is what's termed the straight flush recipe. You can vendor a unique bow, a rare bow, a magic bow, and a normal rarity bow, and they also all need to be the same type of bow. And in exchange for this, you will receive 5 chance orbs. This is not a very useful recipe. It's one a lot of people don't know even exists, but it's just in the game. It's just something that's a cool little Easter egg that almost never matters. However, there are a number of vendor SPs that are much more powerful than this. So those vendor SPs, they're remnants of a slower era of the game, but a lot of the other ones are really, really important to know. Arguably, the single most important vendor SP is the physical damage weapon vendor SP. Now, this is one that most characters don't need, but the characters that need it, this is absolutely god tier 4. What you want to do is vendor a weapon, ideally the highest level base that your character can equip at the moment, plus a blacksmith's whetstone, plus a rustic sash. And the effect of this vendor SP is going to scale with the rarity of that rustic sash. So magic is tolerable, rare is good, unique is fantastic. Now, if you play a physical weapon build, what you're going to want to do is pick up every rustic sash that drops and hit it with an essence that you have no other use for, especially the very, very lowest tier of essences. And those essences, as well as your whetstones, you're going to want to save them in order to do this vendor SP. You want to do this at least twice per 3 acts. Sometimes you want to do it more than that, because so much of your character's power is tied up in the amount of physical damage that is printed on your weapon. And whilst this will not give you a fantastic weapon, it will give you one that is absolutely serviceable. It will be good enough to get you through the campaign. You might happen to find better, so do keep IDing weapons just in case they're better again. Another important recipe, this is one that is useful if you get bad luck with boots, but you get good luck with quicksilver flasks. Movement speed boots recipe. Here you need a set of magic or rare boots that have 0 to 25% movement speed on them, a quicksilver flask, and an orb of augmentation. Vendor all 3 in one transaction, and you'll receive a magic set of boots back that has 1 tier higher of movement speed. That'll only be magic, and chances are early in the game you don't have any regal orbs, because regal orbs are quite rare. So what you want to do is not actually apply an orb of augmentation to them, but instead go to the crafting bench and craft a single resist on them. So if your input was a 15% movement speed boots, your output will be a 20% movement speed boots. You can then go and put a little bit of resistance on them, and that will be good enough to get you through the campaign, unless you get lucky and find something better. Only do this if you have the quicksilver flasks though, and that will just come down to RNG. A number of other important vendor SPs relate to getting jewelry that is of normal rarity. This can then be hit with an Orb of Alchemy, or more commonly, hit with an essence. If you have an iron ring and a skill gem, this will give you a single resistance ring. For example, an iron ring and a red skill gem will give you a ruby ring. You can then throw an essence on that. An amulet plus a blue, a red, and a green gem, this will give you an onyx amulet. An intelligence amulet and a strength amulet and a transmute, This will give you an intelligence and strength base. This is a very useful recipe just for getting those bases when you're playing a character that's having trouble with 2 attributes at once. If you have all 3 different types of 2-stone rings, you can vendor them together for a prismatic ring. Now, this is generally something you would only do if those 2-stone rings rolled poorly. So if you're picking up 2-stone rings and identifying them and you end up getting trash, this is a way that you can recycle them, get a new base back that maybe with an essence can become at least useful. All of these are at least situationally useful. You won't use them every time you run through the campaign, but you will find that they will sometimes solve a problem that your character is having, and they'll solve it pretty effectively. After this, we have the 5-for-1 and 3-for-1 vendor recipes. 3 of the same unique, all non-corrupt. So for example, you vendor 3 copies of the Brass Dome. What you'll get back is a new copy of that unique. I like to think of this as sacrificing 2 of those unique items in order to apply both a Divine Orb and a Sacred Orb to one of the others. This is at its most useful when you've got a unique item that is not particularly rare, but that has a very wide roll range on something, and it's only good if it rolls really well. Another very similar recipe is 5 bad rare items, all on the same base, and this time corruption is okay on the inputs. What you'll get back here is a new rare item on that same base. Now that rare item will be unidentified, and you can then ID it. The thing that's really important here is that this can give you a few esoteric bases that you otherwise cannot get at all. For example, this can get you craftable prismatic jewels. Worth keeping that in mind, there's a couple of situations where this is really useful, potentially with an ornate quiver, which is another base that can't otherwise exist. There's a couple of endgame exclusive vendor recipes as well. If you vendor 60 breach rings, you'll get something fun called a grasping mail. Most of the time when you identify this, it'll be terrible, but occasionally it can be really, really good. A level 20 support gem plus 1 gem cutter's prism will give you a level 1 version of that support gem that has maxed quality, 20% quality. Historically, this also worked with skill gems. That was changed back, I think, in patch 3.23, and now it is only for support gems. If you have 40 quality worth of gems that have a fire tag on them and a normal rarity caster weapon, then this will grant you a +1 to fire skills weapon. And the same applies for the other 4 damage types. So the same applies for chaos, for lightning, for cold, and for physical. This can be used to level a second character, but it can also be used in conjunction with other crafting methods to try and get something really, really good on an endgame weapon. And of course, there is one vendor recipe that might actually be a bit less important in 3.27, and this is the way to bail out when you overlevel a gem, especially a quality gem. So I call this the oops, I leveled my clarity too high recipe. A gem plus an orb of scouring gives you the same gem back, but 1 level lower. If you change that to an orb of regret instead, then it will apply this infinitely many times, and so the gem will come back at level 1, instead of coming back just 1 level lower. This one is something that's worth keeping in mind. Most of the time you won't need it, but there are definitely times you don't want to level a gem, and this is there for you. Okay, now we have one of the most complex topics. Here, I just want to flag a problem, something that a lot of people get wrong. This is related to kill attribution. There are some mechanics that care about you personally landing a killing blow. Does this include your traps, your totems, or your minions? The answer is, it is a very, very, very complicated. If you think of an interaction where this is important, then I want you to seriously research it. I'm not going to go through all the details in this video because it would go on too long. Definitely research it extensively if you think that this is going to come up for your build, because it matters whether it's instant application damage or damage over time that kills the monster. It matters whether the proxy that is doing the damage is actually present still or not. There's a whole lot of complexities here. Not going to go into the details, just research this if you need it, because this is a mechanic that can definitely ruin a build, and it's much more counterintuitive than it seems. I certainly don't know all these details, but I do know where to find that information if I need it. Next, a couple of tips for people who are coming to Path of Exile 1 after having played Path of Exile 2. Firstly, damage conversion works completely differently between Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2. I'm going to ask you to forget everything you know about Path of Exile 2 damage conversion, which is going to be tricky. Actually, Path of Exile 1 damage conversion is extremely complicated. A second tip for Path of Exile 2 players: Exalted Orbs. Do not fritter these things away. They're not super valuable in POE 1, but they are very, very rare. In fact, they are the same rarity as Divine Orbs. There is no really good way to target farm them. There's a couple of ways you can target farm them, but nothing fantastic. And ultimately, whilst they don't have the buying power of a Divine Orb, they are as rare as one. You're not going to get many of them, so just use them pretty sparingly. Thirdly, supplementary defense layers. They matter more in Path of Exile 1 than they do in Path of Exile 2. It's not just evasion, armor, and energy shield here. There's all sorts of mechanics like passive block, spell suppression, reduced damage taken, damage conversion from one type to another, all sorts of shenanigans. Ultimately, builds tend to need some of these layers in them to go beyond tier 16 maps. At that point, you're going to start needing to have more and more of these defensive layers in there. Also, Chaos Orbs and Val Orbs do different things to what they do in Path of Exile 2. Unlike in Path of Exile 2, gem levels do not matter equally to every build, or even close to equally. In Path of Exile 2, it's pretty much always a good stat. In Path of Exile 1, it's pretty much a dead stat to a lot of different builds. There are exceptions though. So attack builds, generally speaking, don't get much out of scaling gem levels. Spell builds generally do. There are exceptions. Some of these include the bow attack skill Caustic Arrow, where the chaos damage over time scales up considerably with gem level, or Elemental Hit of the Spectrum, where most of the damage doesn't come from your weapon, most of it comes from the gem. There are also a couple of spell builds that break this rule a little bit. Things like Righteous Fire scale off your player's life pool and energy shield pool, which is quite different to scaling off the gem level of the Righteous Fire gem. In fact, that's been something that's changed. Until recently, Righteous Fire did scale quite aggressively with gem level as well. The key point to make here though is that the amount of gem levels you can get is much lower in Path of Exile 1 than it is in Path of Exile 2, and that each individual one typically matters about the same amount for spell builds, but matters considerably less for attack builds. Attack builds might only gain 2 or 3% more damage for each gem level that they build in. And I want to finish with some endgame miscellaneous tips, things that don't really fit into any of the earlier categories. Firstly, the harvest mechanic. This can be used to economically change one elemental resistance modifier into another. You won't have quite enough harvest goo to do this frivolously early on in progression, but by the time that you're starting to push into yellow or red tier maps, this is something that you can target if you need it. And I want to encourage you to try this with special modifiers that grant you a resist but also have a rider. For example, maybe you might find a modifier that says 47% cold resistance and 43% increased damage against chilled enemies. What would happen if you change that from cold resistance into lightning resistance? Well, I'll leave that as an exercise to you to find out. Also, fractured items. These cannot have or gain influences other than Eater of Worlds or Searing Exarch influence. This, however, was not always true, and so if you do play in one of the permanent leagues like Standard or Permanent Hardcore, then there are some items that explicitly break this rule. They were created during patch 3.24 when it was possible to do so. Now, Blight encounters. Blight encounters have warnings over lanes. These indicate resilience against a particular type of tower. For example, if you see a minion icon, it does not mean that they're immune to minion damage. It means they will ignore blight towers that deal minion damage. So build a different tower there, but don't feel you need to change up your own character's damage there. And perhaps one of the most important things of all, this is something where I'm going to give one piece of advice if you play in the solo self-found mode, and a very different piece if you play in trade. If you're in solo self-found, you want to be a jack of all trades, and it is okay to be a master of none. However, if you're playing in Trade League, you don't want to be a jack of all trades, master of none. You want to be a master of one trade. You want to find one area of the game that you can develop, if not top 0.1% knowledge, at least top 1% knowledge, which is actually not as hard as it might seem, because many people know absolutely nothing about specific mechanics like Heist. You can very reasonably become one of the most knowledgeable players around about Heist and also about Blight, but you're not going to become one of the most knowledgeable players in every single aspect of the game. In Trade League though, it is very beneficial to be a master of one area of the game, because you will be able to make a lot more currency out of that, which will then help you pick up other areas that you're interested in dabbling in. And the very final topic we're going to talk about is crafting with Metamods. Metamods are crafting bench options that require Divine Orbs in order to be applied to an item. Examples of these include cannot roll attack mods, can roll up to 3 crafted modifiers, or prefixes cannot change. There are 5 of these Metamods, and they're involved in a lot of advanced crafting shenanigans. A couple of little tips with these. An item that is modified with can have up to 3 crafted modifiers, prefixes cannot change, and suffixes cannot change. If the item has space for one more modifier on it at this point, so you've got the 3 crafted modifiers and you've got 2 existing modifiers on it, you can have a large amount of agency over what this additional modifier ends up being. For example, you could use Reforge this item with a guaranteed Veiled mod from a Veiled Chaos Orb, or you could use Reforge this item with a guaranteed Influence mod from Harvest Crafting. If you do this, none of the existing mods can be removed, but the game is forced to add one of these mods on. This is an example of what I term isolation crafting, which is a crafting general philosophy that I put out a video on recently. It was about Path of Exile 2 originally, but it does apply to Path of Exile 1 as well, except the concrete examples that are given in that video relate to Path of Exile 2. But when you do isolation craft in this way, you're guaranteed to add on a mod that would be hard to get via other means, and this can be something that's very, very powerful in advanced crafting tricks. Also, after you've done this, you can then remove all of those metamods with the crafting bench, and then you can put something else on it in its place. Finally, these metamods do not work with fossils or essences, so don't try that. Anyways, that is a huge list of things I wish I'd known earlier, or maybe not me personally, but someone else that I know has wished they knew those earlier. I'm going to leave it there. May your Valorbs have interesting and humorous results.